In Aboriginal American culture, death is viewed largely as a transition, a passing on from the physical vessel to another dwelling place, free from our earthly shackles. As to where this dwelling place existed, there were many schools of thought, forming a great schism between hundreds of tribes. Some believed the spiritual essence could remanifest itself and actualize into a compositional frame of nature. Some found our connection to be closer than even that, and that our ancestors could visit us during certain times, wandering down from the ethereal plane to offer some kind of respite. It was with both relief and angst that I watched as the dying man fell from his summit into the muddy trench by my side. It looked like his leg had broke on the way down. His face, now expressionless, imprinted itself on my mind the way a fiery brand melts through soft tissue. But it wasn't like the other times, and definitely not like the first. Right there in the middle of it all, blood-stained, exhausted, and mentally weary, I began to feel culpable not only to the atrocity of death, but to my own weakness. He hadn't made a sound in falling to his death, but I knew somewhere he was crying, reaching out for a last chance. Something inside me wilted, tearing open a vault of lies and transgressions, weighing heavy on my conscience. Stupefied, I crawled away from him. I couldn't look anymore. It wasn't about the guilt. It was about the decision to end a life. I tied my own emotions to that of soldiers throughout the centuries. Young men forced to choose between themselves or the other son of a bitch. But I was neither young nor brave. But the cause did mean something. Given that, I mounted up and took another arrow randomly from the quiver and started out into the ravine where I could hear their stomping. Doubtful about the odds, I hastened to one side where they couldn't see. The shadows grew thicker until the whole wood was cloaked in a veil of ambiguity. Now my senses seemed more important, as they hinged on whether or not I could walk out of this. I planted myself around the bend from them, waiting, tensely listening for some indication of their approach. There was some breathing. I could make out the steam from each exhale, and when they drew closer, the outline of their masks and fur coats. The next man followed suit around the corner. He was taller than the first, bundled up in gear and layers. Their profiles staged the scene in the openness. Where they would end, I might end also. It seemed in theory a better way than to die pathetically in a hospital room. I clutched my arrow and darted out at the first man, commandeering his weapon for my own. My stronger hand wrapped around his jugular, and I backed him up against the wall of the ravine. "Aye, aye!" came from the taller fellow. "Let him go." I asserted some confidence. "You get rid of that piece and we'll talk." "No, sir," he said. "Then what'll it be?" "It'll be whatever you make it. I got no say on the matter now." "You back up and get rid of that, or I'm going to let him have it," I said. We were grounded pretty well against the wall of the trench. I felt secure enough in my position to make these demands. "I'll let you have it, you—" His words were drowned out by a successive blasts of gunfire. I blinked and braced tightly for each muzzle flare, knowing that I had a meat shield. It thrashed my hostage's body around like a doll. I could feel the impact, but no piercing. He pumped the action again and stepped forward some to get an angle on me. The tall man leaned in some more to finish me off. I found a rock and threw it at him. He stumbled backward a bit and took aim again. I cowered behind the body, feeling the inevitability of death's embrace. Somewhere out of this, the crack of a rifle broke through the trees. The tall man went down hard and dropped his gun in the iced-up mud. Still afraid to leave my human shield, I breathed there, patiently running over all the explanations for this. I didn't imagine that any of the crew had betrayed their leader. but as the saying goes, no honor among thieves. A combined payload of fear and curiosity ate at me here, enough that I forgot about the corpse that lay over my body. Hints of moonlight radiated through the branches as the second snowstorm ensued. It wasn't long before the ground and every nook of the forest was coated in a fresh layer of sleet. A faraway galloping sound emanated from the mercurial haze, and I questioned whether this was the right time to make myself visible. It seemed so, but I couldn't tell the intentions of the person who had seen fit to target my own enemy. The presumption was that if he was against my enemy, that he must be my friend, but that wasn't a very good logical conclusion. So I stayed put, hearing all of this, observing what I could from my place tucked away in the pocket of the ravine. Time lingered a bit here, as intensity built, and my own catalog of hopes rose up, defining each individual moment like pieces of a crescendo. It wasn't like feeling doomed, more like the emotions when you discover how wrong you've been in an argument, and you know you'd do anything within your power to reverse the hurt inflicted on a loved one. But it stayed. It didn't die like some before. The truth moved around me, through me, and dwelled there, till I seized up from the overpowering simplicity of it all. The galloping sounded nearer every second. I reached around inside the fellow's coat to see if I could find a spare weapon, and ran on a .38 Special. It was beat up from the projectiles, but had a full cylinder and cocked nicely. I recalled then that the girl was still hiding not far from me. I hoped that she was unharmed, but I didn't know for sure. Out of the depths of this, I directed my gaze to a dark figure approaching on horseback. My angle was about right to glimpse the upper half of his body, and the wide-brimmed hat sitting on his head. The hooves beat the ground with rhythm and a restrained pace, but the rider looked indifferent, blank in some ways. The trotting stopped as soon as the pair reached the ravine. I watched them dismount, and the squeak of a polished saddle layering over the ambient snowfall. It clicked with me who he was, but I had some trouble convincing myself. We hadn't talked in a couple years, but it looked very much like the bow-legged profile of Brian Thatcher. He walked closer to the edge and peered down to where I lay. Not trusting this, I raised the pistol up and aimed it at him. He was well aware of me. "Now what the hell are you doing down there?" came from the figure. I hesitated. "Resting up? How about you?" "I'm tired and cold. Horse took a tumble a mile or two back. Pretty near broke my own damn neck." He moved a little closer along the ridge to have a better look at the bodies. It somewhat surprised me when I saw him shoulder his rifle again. "There's more of 'em out there, you know." "I'm looking at one of 'em," he said. I moved to get out from the spot in the mud, but he rebuked me. "Stay down there now. You'll get yourself shot." I jumped a little as the snap produced when the rifle broke the sound barrier. He brought his rifle from his cheek and gave me a funny look. "He's running. Get on up out of there." I did so with some difficulty, shoving the body aside and picking up the other dead man's shotgun. Brian helped me up out of the mud and onto higher ground, where I could see a handful of individuals riding out away from us. "It's been a while," I said. He stayed quiet, marching back to tend to his horse. I followed a few paces behind and kept my eyes on the trees. Though it seemed a fortuitous encounter, I couldn't attribute any of it to luck or chance. It was far too meaningful and familiar a kinship between us to dismiss. "She's still down there?" he grumbled. I stopped for a second, puzzled at his knowledge. "Uh-huh. We better get her, too. She's shot in the leg." Brian rested himself over the saddle and gawked at me with his smart eyes. When you get over there, I want you to tell her I'm a stranger. I scanned the trees around us for a moment, not too trusting of the silence. How's that? I said, tell her I'm a stranger. Best she doesn't know about me. Okay, I said. He fed his horse something from the pouch and gave a look to the clearing where the rest of the gang had fled. Climb up on the nag. We'll get going. I mounted the old horse after him and held on to the shotgun. He steered her off in the direction of the clearing where some old fence ran down to meet the ravine. The mare limped along with a tone of pain but also tolerance. She and her rider had a relationship, it seemed. The tolerance and good nature of the beast was matched by her stiff orientation. We got over to where I'd left the young lady. Brian dismounted and worked on rolling a cigarette. She moved a little when she saw it was me. I could see her eyes glaring out at us with an understandable indignation. She thought I'd walked out on her, left her to get raped so I could save my own life. And that's all right. I passed no judgments on her. You can come out now, I said. Her shifty gaze wandered a little, and I watched an arm move out from under the snow and brush. They're gone now, miss. We have this gentleman here to thank for our lives. She climbed all the way out of the brush into full view and started picking up the gear I'd left. It looked like she'd followed my instructions. The blood staining her pant legs was frozen, no fresh wounds. I approached and she handed off my compass and a few other things. I closed that wound up, it's fine for now. I knelt down for a look and brought my eyes back to her level. You did a good job with it. Old man Brian's voice piped up here, growling out between us. My old mare can't handle but 2 riders, and ma'am, you're a full-grown woman. I turned around to address him, limping a little through the snow. I made the trip out here on foot, and I'll make it back. Brian tossed a cigarette and bit off a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. You sure that's a good idea with them hoodlums running around here? Doesn't matter. I can't slow her down from getting to a doctor. The woman stayed silent, shivering in a slumped posture a few feet away. Brian kept to himself at this. I thought I saw him nod a little before replacing the grub satchel. He turned his head upward and scanned the trees like a veteran scout. Then he dug through some of his things and brought out a Beretta 45 ACP. That 38's rusted, he began. Pack this around, and for God's sake, don't fire it unless you have to. So I took it from him and tucked it under my belt. He followed this with a leather ammo pack. Contents felt a mite hefty for just ammo. I seen your sled on the other side of the valley. That's what tipped me off on your location. He looked off again. If I were you, I'd leave that and start walking. They're running for now, but sooner or later, they'll get brave. I'll scavenge these weapons. You do that, you'll get yourself in trouble. I mean that. I gave him a surprised stare. He came closer and slid an envelope in my coat pocket. You find a quiet spot and give that a look, he whispered. The forlorn girl wandered over to me, and we locked eyes for a few moments. She reached her hand out, brushing it along my shoulder to the back of my neck. Leaning in as if to give a kiss, she moved her face along mine, brushing and inciting affection. But her eyes read differently, like a drugstore novel with some tragic, mystical ending. I tucked my chin in and embraced her for another moment, soothing the sharp pain and anguish as best I could. I felt a little silly here, since there was no indication that her advance was met with anything other than gratitude. Then the tears came, and she squeezed me tighter, letting go of all the internal dialogue and fearfulness. Without any invocation, she let go of me and started for the horse and rider. Brian approached and passed me his tobacco pouch with paper. "Make a poultice if you get cut." It was with stale morale and an uncertain heart that I watched as the two made leave against the portrait of nightfall. The unsure gallop of the horse beat the ground, marking a conspicuous trail through the dead field. A song entered my mind. I wasn't sure what brought it on, but it snuck up on me like a wisp of an old dream. Something was bothering me. It didn't make sense. I'd made the right decision, and now I was alone. Chapter 9. "You hear that, Mama?" The words rang out with a constant vibration through my mind. A vague calmness preceded this, and I found myself stumbling through denser trees with icy fingers and a poorly rolled cigarette hanging from my mouth. I drew from it until it burned my lips, then tossed it out into the whiteness. Here my pain grew tenfold, marching right up and pouring itself out on me. I recalled my lumberyard days, moving nonstop like a locomotive. Flirting with death and misery had become my new pastime. She was like a seductress, moving around, teasing and taunting me, with serpent-like agility and lustful eyes. We'd played around so long it seemed time to do something about the whole situation. It wasn't casual anymore. It couldn't be. Now she'd done her dance, floating around magnificently, stunning my nerves with beauty and fleshly temptation. "Do I hear what?" came back. My mother's face shot down at me from the clear moon. I stooped to one knee and grabbed hold of the first thing I could find. "It's singing. The angel." I traced back to find context for this. It wasn't easy. That was a rough time for me, especially for a kid. "What angel? I don't see anything," she replied. "That's because you're not looking." "I'm looking the best I know how, sweetheart, and you are fevered, so just lay back." "She's watching you." Then came a different voice from somewhere.
"I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing. I was a stranger and you left me on the street. I was naked and you laughed. I was a prisoner and you left me behind bars."
It was not the voice of an angel, but instead a more masculine voice, sweeping through like a gust of ocean wind. The angel swayed in closer till she was nearly on me. Her soothing skin and brilliant Aryan features were matched by the strangeness of the peril in her eyes. In totality, they fed a delusion within my own self, a primal desire for the queen and enchantress. She appeared to embody every man's lusts, including mine, but the endlessness of her pupils hearkened only to death. It was a mind game, a trick. The face was not real, nor were any of the outward qualities delineated by the illusion. Then something different happened. The scene changed. The mode was shifted, and I was cast with open lungs into a colder, darker room. There was a lampshade, a table with beer and cigarettes, and a man sitting placidly on the far side of the table. His hair looked dirty and stiff the way it does after spending days under a hat. He lifted a hand and waved distantly at me. I thought he looked familiar, but he was too far out and the lighting was bad. A radio station faded in, melding the stream of my own awareness with that of the memories and flavors of old times. The atmosphere sank in, pushing out whatever inclinations or feelings with which I had entered. Then the man opened his mouth and said something. "I see you're in one piece." I was swamped with a myriad of emotions when I recognized the voice of my grandpa. "You called me 3 hours ago, and you don't get back till now?" I started to speak, but someone spoke for me. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." It was my own voice 20 years younger, and with a slightly country twang. "When your parents died, I made a choice. I could keep living in my own filth here, healing old wounds and getting myself pissed drunk, or I could make the best of myself, correct my faults, and take care of you." "You're drunk now," said my younger part. Pop curled his fists a little and scooted back in his chair. "You're right. I am. I'm drunk as hell. And you know why? You want to know why I'm sitting here smoking this shit? 'Cause you can't make a curfew. You're too busy for my curfew. Ain't that right? Old man like me don't know nothing about what you're going through because I'm too old. Ain't that what you're saying?" "I didn't say that, Pop." "Well, you're sure as hell thinking it. You think you know the world? You think you got it all figured out, don't you? You think you can hide from responsibility. I know what you're thinking, 'cause I thought the same things you're thinking now when I was your age. Did it ever occur to you that I might know a thing or two that you don't?" The man tossed his ashes and scratched at his arms a little. "Now listen, you are in my household. The rules of my household apply to you when you are living here. You are not immune to them, much as you'd like to be." My younger part stepped forward into the lamplight that glistened over the center of the room. "I understand, Pop. But you assume to know things about me that you don't have the slightest clue about. I raised your father, and you're his blood. You're my blood. I've got something in me that he never had." "And what's that?" he growled. "Ambition." A silence draped itself over the room. The crickets, not caring, continued to drone outside through the screened windows. Pop sat there for a minute, contemplating. He knew what he had on his hands, but he didn't know how to deal with it. So he sat there, still as a painting, all the thoughts grouping together in order and chaos, not drifting but never quite landing. He struck a match and cupped it up to his cigarette. A cloud of smoke went up, and I smelled the smell of his favorite tobacco brand. "You want to know what you've got? You got pride and arrogance," he said. "I'll give you you're smart. No denying that. But underneath, well, that's the stuff that matters. So if you ignore everything else I say, just listen to this. Don't let your pride be your downfall. Don't you do it. Don't. I lost your father to that, and I'm not losing you, okay? I'm not losing you." The lamplight dimmed, then faded, and the coolness of the house turned into frigid temperatures of my white hell. I was gripping a tree hard for support. Nothing moved my soul more than the thought of what transpired then. What happened now was forever tainted by the past. I was caged inside my own self-perpetuated prison, churning with an everlasting sickness that would not go away. It worked pretty well to keep the memories out, or at least to keep them from pushing me towards anything of significance. My conscience felt as though it had to agitate things whenever times got rough, as if a couple of little men sat with their hands on the valve, letting out just a little every few months. I didn't really know what to think, or whether I should think at all. The blizzard was growing on me. It felt like I'd walked a good distance, but I couldn't tell. There was an incline just ahead of me leading up to what looked like a deep forest. It occurred to me that I might have covered more ground in my haste than I'd imagined. The trees were like the kind that grew along the north side of the land reserved by Rogerton. The twisted pines and great jack pines. A sea of giants reached out, beckoning me here. The thought of venturing inside felt ludicrous now that my body was in shambles. But I thought about how that decision could end, how I could be swallowed by the expanse and never come out. But the compass and stars proved to be in my favor, for all indicators said that I was standing at the immediate edge of the great forest, something that the locals had called it since the 19th century. I looked back in sudden recollection of the bandits. I could feel them encroaching on me, but nothing was to be seen. Then another thought occurred to me. I left my bow. It wasn't a particularly sacred tool to me, but I was fond of it, and my discipline in archery had saved my life and that of the girls. But now I had both pistols, the Beretta given to me by Brian and the .38 Special from the ditch. Moving into the trees, I found myself a nook by a downed tree where I could warm my hands. The wind was deadened in here and diminished further as I went in. Without that assailant, the cold didn't seem half as threatening. A little friction between the hands and the lighter helped my condition. Moving on a little further, I started to feel warm, even a bit hot. I immediately recognized what this was and stripped off the extra layers of my coat and my stocking cap. The warmth was contained now that I was out of the wind. I'd exerted enough energy to work up a good lather, and consequently, the whole hygiene situation was worse now than ever. I leaned against a tree for a moment to roll another cigarette. Here I took notice of a grouping of red neon lights glowing at me through the wooded theater. They reached out from the darkness ahead, not moving. The coloration was flat, suppressed, I thought, by the blanket of white. They did not flicker or blink, but stayed perfectly steady through the drooping branches. So that was it. I'd made my decision, and I hastened my steps through the ever-deepening thicket, wandering around in an alien manner. It was in a sort of uncertain stupor that I embarked, not caring what happened at this point, or thinking I did not care, and not particularly intimidated by the remainder of the journey. I knew the way from here, to be sure. The problem was that I did not know what awaited me when I reached town. I was sure of Brian as a friend, but it seemed like he had something to hide as well. Just then, I remembered the envelope that I was carrying in my breast pocket. I felt for it to make sure it was still inside, and it was. Contrary to the exertion and great measures taken to save the girl from death, it felt like I was slipping into a widening trap. I envisioned the powerful jaws of the justice system opening up to receive me. And then the vision blackened, and all I saw was the curious lights staring out at me from the thick of the trees. Some time later, I found myself approaching a clearing. This was no ordinary clearing, however, with jagged stumps of trees spotted and tapered through the midst. Nature reduced to a multitude of ugly fence posts. Walking out, I got the keen sense that something horrifying had taken place here. The smell of gasoline and charred plastics created a very unsettling vibe. I moved forward with a little trepidation, keeping my eyes fixed on the spectacle of glowing lights not far away. The fixture that was made visible through the flurries came as something of a shock to me. A convex and almost torpedo-like geometry was made apparent, dazzling and confusing me simultaneously. Just a few more paces and I was nosed up alongside the massive object. Replacing my gloves, I brushed away an afternoon's worth of snow to unveil a window into the inside. It was a plane. A jet, to be more precise. Had it been daylight, I'm sure I would have discerned this sooner. The turbines looked to be ruined and torn up. A coat of soot covered the entire back half along the fins, even stretching down to the cockpit. The whole picture became much clearer as I swept away the snow. Circling back around, I investigated the lights which had drawn me here to begin with. They were tucked in an awkward place under the tail of the plane, but they were very bright, so much so that when I removed the snow, it hurt my eyes to look for very long. There was obviously still power being diverted to this tail light. For now, I assumed that it was backup power. Another look through the windows showed the green light of some kind sitting in amongst the wreckage. From the dimensions, I thought it to be a glow stick. Then, to my horror, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw the outline of a human hand. A cacophony of notions descended here. The force that drew me further in was a strong but unreliable one, not having anything to do with sober thought. My deduction, half dead and full of whiskey, was that the dangerous group had somehow survived this crash and made flight on foot. I paused everything and sat myself down in the snow for a moment. I scooted in a little further to get the light from the tail section. Lifting the note out of the envelope, I skimmed through, taking short breaks to look up and check my surroundings. The note read, "Some time ago I swore an oath to serve and protect the people of this nation. It was with no light burden that I did so. The actions I took against other humans in the name of freedom are something that I regret continually. Ever since, I have been looking for reasons to mop up the bloody mess that I participated in creating. Now something has happened that I find hard to fathom. It looks like the dam has broke loose and all my worst fears have become a reality." I looked up cautiously for an instant. The message felt personalized. An old friend spilling his guts in an unexpected turn of events. But now I have to do what I know is right. I do not know how I will get there, but God willing, I will make amends. These people are violent and pathological, so it seems like I may have to fight one last fight after all. The consequences of not standing up at this point are greater than ever. It is my suspicion that the latter days of this country are at hand. Without any recourse or ability to affect my government or bureaucracy, I can only stand as an individual with a moral constitution. I understand that this sort of phraseology can be somewhat ambiguous, so let me put it plainly and carefully. I am a terrorist. Under the laws of the land, what I do is considered treason. I would like to emphasize this. It is my informed opinion that our representatives are no longer looking out for the best interests of the people. Our allegiance is not something that is owed, it is earned. I feel that working directly with people and agencies with whom I disagree fundamentally is a severe conflict of interests. I'm a very different man from what I was 20 years ago. I hope you can come to see things my way. And down below it said, May 21st, 2009. All at once, it felt like a very good idea to jump up from my seat and rush to town, but I soon learned of a more graphic angle to the story. The pitfalls were revealed to my eyes, and suddenly they began to appear all around. My eyes moved downward, and I examined the second paragraph of the note. United States District Attorney. A memorandum of a telecon transcript, January 8th, 2009, 12:35 p.m. Sent to rmo@gmail.com. It has come to my attention that the evidence admitted for last week's session was negligible. The dockets leave out a considerable portion of what was needed to establish a case against the accused. I have made an effort to conduct a thorough investigation on behalf of my constituents. The matter is time-sensitive, and I feel obligated to inform you that failure to prosecute the individuals in question will ultimately result in all of us being implicated. There are loopholes out of this, but we've come far enough and our hands too dirty to even flirt with the possibility of disclosure. Right now I am sitting with the committee in Washington. They seem to be leaning in our favor, but it's difficult to tell. This felt like the tip of the iceberg. I flipped the note over to reveal a smaller paragraph continuing the script from page 1. For posterity's sake and to keep a personal record of this event, I have arduously typed every name on that docket. The final product was proofed by my secretary and with no context and thus no association other than to ensure its grammatical correctness and to save me from further labor. Please keep in mind that this list is classified information. You should not open this folder in public and certainly never on an unencrypted device. The paper was blank past this. I looked around in the envelope to see if I could find the part containing the list. What my fingers ran upon was a photograph. Not the kind from a crisp digital camera, but a faded and stained print from an old celluloid. Drawing it closer to get a sure look at the features, it bore the likeness of the fellow from the ditch, the one Brian had fired on and killed. Stunned, I picked myself up from the ice by the wreckage and peered inside the fuselage again to get a look at the destruction. There were 2 or 3 dead bodies inside, but I wasn't about to venture in. It looked to me like a conspiracy involving governments. And now, in the wake of recent events, it proved to be a bit more than just a theory. I began to see things from an entirely unique perspective. Like I'd been lost at sea and at the epicenter of my turmoil and rage. I'd been thrown an anvil. Blood rushed to my head as I struggled to formulate something that resembled a thought. The quiet sculpture of the scene formed itself, deepened by an urgency that tangled and maimed me. I clamped my fingers together, pressing both thumbs against my brow, and so, rather backwards from the ordinary, the suggestion and the urges pressed back against me. A whole life of thoughts and stimuli reduced to a single moment in time. You don't choose what happens to you past a certain point. Sure, there's an illusion of control, but that fades the minute you come face to face with forces beyond the self. The part of you thought would hold up against hard times is the part that turns out to be the most susceptible. Despair, grief, confusion, hatred, all the litany of voices begin to sing chorus in your head, and it never stops beating. It won't stop moving. Not for a precious second. Not till you realize, since you came into this world alone, you'll have to die alone. These were my thoughts as I sat in the cold. No scripture could comfort me here. though I tried to recall a few. I could remember my teeth chattering, holding on for dear life against a cruel wind. The light melded with the darkness and became a tangible part of the elevated experience. Here in my clouded state of awareness, a truer form appeared to me than anything I had seen in my childhood. Something warm ran down my cheek, reminding me of my attachment to the physical world. I tasted it and pursed my lips. Then from the heart of this sprang a newness, something divine, but also an outspread of rage which took form in all shapes and colors. The night weighed on, but my soul was somewhere else. From the depths of this, my heart jumped and sent my higher form back down into the flesh. I came back in a start, with my hands and feet frozen to the ground. A simplified notion came to mind. I'd been granted a small taste of the liberation that death offers, but I also felt a horror underlying every element of the theme of this life after death. There was a keen sense of the infinite. I couldn't say whether I'd passed fully over or not, but it felt a lot like death. Just a glimpse of the distant journey between the earthly holding cell and all of eternity. When my senses came back, they came back in waves. First, the lucid, nightmarish quality of the forest, then the pain, and then the hyper-awareness and self-consciousness that drained every day of its joy. I felt very stupid after this, considering my distance from the town. It was just 3 miles from here, but now I thought I would never get out. The temperature had dropped since I blacked out. I tried to blink, but my lashes were frozen shut. Not accepting defeat, I tore both hands from the iced-up ground to which they'd been molded and picked away the frost from my eyes. Then another danger presented itself. My hands were bleeding from the palms and fingertips. I'd become so numb that I'd hurt myself in a terrible way. And so it came from this that my body woke up completely. I fell face forward into the snow, hitting my head on the mud. I immediately pushed myself upward when I smelled the jet fuel. Scrambling to my feet, I could finally see that there was a nasty film of this fuel covering most of the ground nearby. The sting from this on my bleeding hands kicked in quickly. I rushed over to some clean snow to remedy this, all the while moaning in agony. The flurries continued, and the northern path that had been so distinct was now somewhat blurred in my head. Notwithstanding, I made my move and started out again, with everything secured and my coat and hat replaced on my body. The following hours were dreadful. I climbed and slipped and trudged through it with the aid of goggles, but the real challenge proved to be navigational. Everything felt off, no matter which route I took. During the latter part of my journey, all paths became identical. The whole time it felt almost as if my future had escaped me, and now, trapped in this chasm of ice and physical torment, I was destined to march the same path over and over again. It became, in many ways, celestial, a great prison confining and blocking me from destiny. But I saw through it. I saw through the aching and the negligence to what really tore me apart. Then I stepped inside and walked around in it. Still feeling everything around me, but nestled somehow in this illusory construct, it seemed as if the transgressions, passive or otherwise, from every stage of my life had been collected and moved for this event. A junction of a sort, sending me thrashing forward into the known and partly the unknown. At once my mind erupted, blooming out like shattered glass or paint. The collective body, as my untrained imagination called it, moved out with a sudden velocity, undulating with and around everything there was or could be in me. I kept my eyes ahead, daring not to wander astray. The force that kept my feet anchored also locked my eyes on a novelty. I couldn't avert my gaze had I wanted to, but there was no reason to look away. No ailments or imperfection which could not be fixed. So I stood there, seemingly empty and full all at once, threadbare, like a once strong knight defeated by the sickness of the world. The idea had slept inside me for so long. The murkiness, feeling that I'd lost my identity, passing my true self on the way down to hell. The dangers of regret and inaction set in here, and I dwelt in the moment for as long as the vision held me. Some mimicry or artifact of my own life set itself out, framing itself in my mind's eye. Finally, my muscles came unlocked, and I found through trial that I could not only move around, but also manipulate the order and partially the geometry of the illusion. So, with this newfound courage, I stepped out a few paces, keeping inside the perimeter of the road. It was an old sort of road with cracks giving way to all manner of weeds and grass. The place looked familiar. I looked around at the buildings, and it came to me that it was my own neighborhood from over a decade ago. The trees were lush, green, and full of life, but the rest of the town portrayed a very different tone. Windows were cracked or missing, rooftops caved in, every foundation overgrown with mold, ivy. It looked like a whole place had gotten sick and collapsed in on itself without warning, or like a sudden breeze had carried through, forcing all the people out in a tragic exodus. I wandered out a little more into the streets where the church stood. There was a light coming from inside. It was glowing and wavering like a candle. Of course, I had to investigate. My inclination was to find out as much as possible within the time I had. There was no indication that I would ever have such an opportunity again in my life, so I mounted those front steps to the tattered old place and took hold of the doorknob. The door wouldn't budge at first, so I applied more pressure, forcing it out on its rusty hinges. Chipped paint fell everywhere at this, dusting the floorboards in front of me. The sight of the interior was something of a mess. There was even a possum who scurried away at my entrance. I disregarded that and walked the aisles to the foot of the altar. There was the candle, flickering dimly in a lonesome spot in front of the pulpit. Turning my face to the podium and its scratches, worn from the cycles of time, I saw the Bible mounted up on the top. It looked considerably well for the wear and nearly out of place in this heap of rotted wood. Then, fading in like a ghost, the preacher's voice shot out through the room. There he stood, commanding a tiny congregation the way a great orator does. I stood in my place, listening for as long as he had words. Then, when he was done, the man looked straight at me, smiling with an outstretched hand. "If this is what you want," he said, "then all you need to do is ask. For the Lord rewards those who diligently seek Him." I stopped and averted eye contact for a moment. "Are you saying that as a man or as a preacher?" The fellow rounded the pulpit and moved down around to my side. "I'm saying this as your friend, but more importantly, as your brother." I backed away, a little shocked at this statement. I never had a brother. "Well, here I am looking at you. We are blood, you and I, but our mother did not care for me. I was too heavy a burden. So like all other things a person strips away in their conquest for happiness, I was cast out like chaff to the wind. And now, here I am, brother. I sat down on the closest pew after hearing this. It gutted me. To think I'd lived my whole life without this person who, for all my fear and indecision, might have acted as a guide and a beacon. Most of all, I felt betrayed. And this wasn't a small betrayal like when a schoolmate snitches or a best friend goes behind your back. It was like hanging off the side of a cliff by a thread, your single most precious hope for deliverance resting on a person, and that very person cutting the thread. Momentarily, I got up from my seat on the pew, stretched out my limbs and hugged the ghost that stood there.